civilian evacuations, quarantine corridors, stockpiling routes for critical supplies. These aren't notes from FEMA. They're written into a zombie apocalypse plan stored on U.S. military servers. Drafted by U.S. Strategic Command as a training exercise, CONPLAN 8888 first surfaced publicly in 2011 through FOIA requests. After COVID-19, revisions across the Department of Defense and allied doctrines began shaping how collapse scenarios are studied, drawing from pandemic guidance, logistics shortfalls, and NAVADMIN-level operational changes. The unsettling part isn't the zombies. It's what the plan now reflects. In this episode, we'll show you 3 things most people don't know: how real pandemic lessons reshaped it, where civilians are still left vulnerable, and the contents likely hidden in its classified annexes. Because what started as a joke plan wasn't written for laughs. The document that was never supposed to exist. When the details of CONPLAN 8888 first reached the public, it appeared absurd on its face. A zombie apocalypse plan written by the Pentagon seemed less like strategy and more like the script of a low-budget film. Newspapers joked about it, blogs labeled it a curiosity, and even some service members dismissed it as a gimmick. Yet the truth behind the document was more unusual than the headlines. This was not satire, but an authentic product of U.S. Strategic Command. Drafted in 2010 and formally issued in April 2011, it was built as a JOPS training tool, a way for officers to practice contingency planning without referencing any real country or enemy. In that setting, zombies played a very practical role. They were an impossible adversary, free from the risk of stirring diplomatic outrage or provoking propaganda once the exercise leaked. The plan's introduction even stated bluntly, this plan was not actually designed as a joke. The context of its creation mattered. Training in the Joint Operation Planning and Execution System had to include realistic operational steps: how to mobilize forces, secure installations, maintain supply lines, and direct command authority. But assigning those steps against a real nation often backfired. Drafting scenarios that listed an ally as a potential threat could cause major diplomatic incidents if discovered. Even fictional enemy states carried the risk of later misinterpretation. The zombie framework solved this. With the undead as the designated opponent, instructors could walk students through logistics planning or evacuation procedures without political risk. The absurd mask allowed them to focus on process. What happened next ensured the plan's reputation would grow far beyond its initial purpose. A redacted version was released in 2011 after a Freedom of Information Act request. Instead of disappearing quietly into training archives, the document spread across the internet. Civilian readers now poured through its pages, encountering tables, phases, and contingency steps laid out in matter-of-fact military jargon. Media outlets replayed the most surreal portions, such as rules of engagement distinctions between vegetarian zombies and evil magic zombies. But alongside the humor, the bones of a real planning framework were unmistakable. The operational phases, shaping, deterrence, domination, stabilization, and restoration of civil authority, were identical to those in plans aimed at genuine crises. Suddenly, what seemed ridiculous became something else: a skeleton plan hiding inside a cartoon costume. Academics treated it as a case study in pedagogy, while conspiracy forums imagined it as secret preparation for catastrophic events. Its cross-pollination of outlandish imagery and sober doctrine made it impossible to categorize cleanly. Was it a gag exercise, a hidden blueprint, or both? The reality sits in between. The zombies themselves were never literal, but they stood in for disruptions so extreme that normal systems would unravel. The text refers repeatedly to infrastructure collapse, food insecurity, and breakdowns in medical capacity. Replace the word zombie with unknown pathogen or mass panic, and the outlines of a serious survival plan appear. The emphasis falls on sustaining forces in a degraded environment, protecting non-combatants, and designating safe zones under conditions where communications are unreliable or collapsed altogether. That recognition reframed the debate about why the plan existed at all. Some commentators argued its timing during the peak of zombie media popularity must have been deliberate, maybe even a form of military psychological operations exploiting public fascination. But specialists in military planning stress a different point. The overlap was likely coincidental. Using zombies in training solved an internal problem, not an external marketing one. Still, the coincidence created fertile ground. Members of the public who were immersed in cultural fascination with zombies now encountered an official document, mirroring that imagery, and the line between exercise and revelation blurred. Another detail often overlooked is that the unclassified release was never self-contained. The version now available includes direct references to classified annexes, anticipated intelligence inputs, and cross-links to other actual contingency plans, covering pandemics, space operations, and continuity of government. The joke frame let drafters simulate full-spectrum planning without showing classified content. But those references underscored that beneath the theatrical mask, the writers were aligning their training with real operational templates. To outside readers, that raised questions. If this is the unclassified surface, what do the hidden annexes describe? The deeper implication was less about fantasy monsters and more about stress-testing institutions. Imagine a nation losing electricity, healthcare, and transport simultaneously. Imagine cascading failures where normal government functions freeze because there is no reliable information. These are not speculative fears. They are conditions that can emerge during pandemics, major cyber attacks, or supply chain collapse. In that respect, zombies were only stagecraft. The lesson was resilience under system-wide stress. By the time COVID-19 struck, the parallels were obvious. Hospitals overrun, shortages of protective equipment, civil authorities scrambling for coordination. Each resembled problem sets already walked through in the pages of CONPLAN 8888. Suddenly, what once looked like quirky humor appeared more like foresight. Officers who had treated the plan as an academic oddity were reminded it held functional logic for real emergencies. This duality, absurd mask, serious message, has made the plan enduring. On one hand, it still invites late-night TV jokes and Reddit threads. On the other, it is taught in classrooms as a successful case of using fiction to navigate planning taboos. It provided an avenue to engage with problems too politically sensitive to approach in straightforward scenarios, and its redacted release allowed an open discussion of fundamental vulnerabilities without revealing classified playbooks. Yet its lingering influence carries unsettled questions. For every reader who laughs at the language, another asks what the disguise conceals. Was it foreshadowing engineered pathogens, accidents in high-containment labs, or just generic collapse scenarios? The range of interpretations keeps the document in circulation, tethering light-hearted banter to serious strategic thought. That ambiguity is precisely what has allowed the plan to remain relevant nearly 15 years after its creation. As the years have passed, what began as a niche training product within Stratcom has been steadily re-evaluated. The plan's structure, designating threat phases, establishing secure zones, sequencing forces, mirrors the architecture of modern national defense planning. And because its face is fictional, it continues to avoid the political risks that plagued more realistic scenarios. Zombies ensure the plan is never taken literally, yet at the same time, its underlying methods keep feeding into instruction about continuity, logistics, and command authority. That paradox leaves us with a simple observation. The plan was never supposed to exist outside training halls. Yet today it remains in circulation, cited in classrooms, invoked in commentary about national preparedness, and discussed whenever questions arise about how militaries confront collapse. The disguise continues to shape how the content is received and understood, and that raises the immediate question that follows logically. Why keep maintaining a zombie plan in the Pentagon's library at all? From fiction to framework, why the military kept zombies? Instead of fading into obscurity, the so-called zombie plan became a fixture inside professional military education. Its staying power had little to do with pop culture and everything to do with function. The scenario offered what a real nation never could, the impossible enemy. According to its own opening statements, CONPLAN 8888's authors deliberately selected an adversary that could never exist, precisely so no government could accuse the United States of designating them a threat. That neutrality gave instructors space to teach the joint operation planning and execution system without sparking headlines or diplomatic protests. Seen that way, zombies worked less as a joke and more as a mask that produced three specific outcomes. First, the mask shielded training from political fallout. A class labeled around a fictional apocalypse meant officers could draft evacuation orders, martial law provisions, or troop deployments without risking a real leader taking offense. Second, it created room for imaginative solutions. Instructors report that when cadets role-played against zombies, They felt free to brainstorm ideas that would feel reckless if tied to a real adversary. Unorthodox quarantine zones, drone-based triage, or aggressive civilian control measures. Those ideas could then be reframed in terms of pandemics or natural disasters once the exercise concluded. And third, the zombie premise doubled as a public distraction. While the redacted version people downloaded from the internet leaned into strange categories like vegetarian zombies, the serious annexes and training methods remained less visible, quietly reinforcing planning practices for collapse scenarios without drawing scrutiny. This layered purpose explains why the plan wasn't retired. Armies don't practice killing the undead, but officers do need to rehearse decision-making under catastrophic conditions. Stripped of the mask, the plan focuses on command continuity, logistics during shortages, infrastructure failures, and civilian protection when panic spreads. Those core processes look strikingly similar, whether the trigger is a fictional outbreak, a cyber attack, or a real pathogen. The plan itself never became an authorized operational order. It stayed a teaching instrument. But staff and educators recognized its usefulness as a rehearsal tool with obvious real-world parallels. By reducing everything to mechanics, the scenario forced students to examine systemic collapse without the usual filters of politics or ideology. What happens when energy distribution dies? How do you keep potable water moving under duress? Who has authority when local governments falter? These aren't theoretical distractions. They are the nuts and bolts of crisis survival. In this way, the fictional frame produced a culture of pragmatism. Officers learned to think less about who the enemy might be and more about what the conditions of collapse would demand. That same framing, ironically, enabled conversations normally too fraught for a classroom. Introducing topics like curfews, forced evacuations, or border shutdowns against a real country would attract immediate criticism. Within the zombie setting, those same measures could be tested safely. Students could role-play escalation of authority from local mayors to federal task forces, practice contingency communication when networks failed, or draft orders for supply rationing, all while staying inside a simulation nobody mistook as literal intent. Through repetition, habits formed. Treat extreme disruption as solvable, not unthinkable. Educators noticed another byproduct. Creativity surged. Ordinarily, junior officers leaned heavily on rehearsed templates, uncertain of how far they could push scenarios. Against zombies, the constraints fell away. Some brainstormed mass triage managed by autonomous systems. Others designed convoy patterns optimized for a population in constant motion. Still others used it to rethink medical supply distribution when cross-border transit collapsed. Once those ideas were tested inside fiction, instructors could pull the useful innovations forward into real preparedness planning. The disguise gave cover for experimentation. Meanwhile, on the outside, the bizarre face of the plan absorbed attention. Civilian readers laughed at descriptions of outlandish zombie types while overlooking the real training embedded inside. That public distraction, unintentional as it may have been, gave the military cover. Outsiders tended to mock instead of probe deeper into the classified annexes, leaving the real pedagogical value intact. To those teaching the plan, it became clear. So long as the mask remained, both sides gained something. The military could practice realistically, and civilians stayed amused rather than alarmed. Over time, the exercise adapted with new details. References to stockpile management, interstate coordination, and biothreat surveillance crept into its training modules. Some of this language mirrored contemporary Department of Defense directives on pandemic response and continuity of operations. While the public release still highlighted comic elements, participants inside the system were working through practical steps. Where to preposition food supplies, how to manage overwhelmed medical facilities, and what rules guided interactions with state governors during emergencies. Beneath fictional labels, the exercise reinforced procedures that officers could apply beyond the classroom. The persistence of zombies thus reflected deliberate utility, not inertia. Remove the mask and classrooms risked devolving into cautious, overstated mimicry of real politics. Keep the mask, and lessons expanded to cover extreme stress tests that official doctrine otherwise shied away from. By 2025, the cartoon surface had thinned, but the framework underneath had grown only more structured. Planners increasingly acknowledged that the zombie label functioned as a shield, a visible absurdity covering rehearsals for very real vulnerabilities. As a symbol, the mask evolved into shorthand within military education. Bring up the zombie plan, and the subtext was, Understood. Officers were about to walk through systemic collapse exercises, unfiltered by diplomatic optics. Those conversations could swing between resource allocation charts and ethical debates on forced containment, all buffered by the guarantee that nobody outside the classroom could mistake the work for an attack scenario. Instructors also used the mask tactically to teach flexibility. Cadets who only ever wrote for conventional battle scenarios tended to rely on rigid patterns of thought. By flipping the adversary into something irrational yet catastrophic, the exercise demanded adaptive thinking. Rather than fill in blanks, officers were asked to problem solve. If airports were unusable, how would forces redeploy? If food supplies decayed within days, how would you feed civilians under protection? By tying creativity to a ridiculous premise, educators broke psychological barriers that slowed innovation elsewhere. Through all of this, the public face of CONPLAN 8888 remained an oddity online, easily dismissed as a quirk. Internally, however, its endurance made sense. It was not the zombies themselves that mattered, they were only the excuse. What mattered was establishing routines for officers to think about collapse directly, without hiding from terrible realities or fearing political controversy. Collapse planning needed a mask, and this one proved surprisingly durable. That durability meant the plan was still being referenced and adapted long after its first release. And while the mask encouraged imagination in classrooms, the world outside supplied its own test. When a real public health emergency arrived and stripped away abstractions, the same themes officers had rehearsed, scarcity, breakdown, and urgent coordination, suddenly looked less like games on paper and more like the lived reality surrounding them. COVID-19, the stress test that rewrote the playbook. When 2020 arrived, it delivered a test no wargame had prepared for, a slow-moving biological disaster spreading beyond borders, saturating hospitals and exhausting supply lines. The U.S. military, like every other institution, found itself adjusting on the fly. Masks, gloves, and ventilators disappeared faster than they could be sourced. Distribution networks stalled, and refrigerated trucks served as makeshift morgues just miles from bases. Officers used to imagining kinetic strikes or cyber breaches now confronted cascading failures of medical systems and logistics. The very kind of system-wide collapse they once only modeled under the zombie mask. The trouble was not that planning for pandemics had been ignored in government. Agencies like the CDC and HHS had protocols on paper, but military integration into those procedures had been minimal. Exercises rarely accounted for every region demanding federal intervention simultaneously. The pandemic revealed how quickly command blurred between governors, state guards, federal agencies, and active duty assets, with responses often duplicating efforts or slowing to a crawl beneath bureaucracy. What emerged was improvisation under pressure, and the costs were measured in lives. Inside the Pentagon, it became evident that the gaps were structural. If an adversary's cyberattack disabled logistics, commanders already had scripts for redundancy. But when a pathogen sabotaged the same lifelines, no equivalent playbook existed. The Navy's reaction illustrated the shift that followed. By late summer, standardized guidance like NAVADMIN 21720 was circulating. New medical screening rules, return-to-work protocols based on CDC guidance, strict definitions of close contact and patient under investigation, and mandatory restriction of movement bubbles before deployment. These updates became templates, proof that the uniformed services were willing to formalize biocontainment measures the way they once rehearsed conventional readiness. From there, after-action reviews pushed 3 changes into doctrine. First was speed in medical logistics. Leaders recognized that hesitation in 2020 had left gear marooned in warehouses. Fixes focused on prepositioning, protective equipment, isolation tents, and testing kits positioned closer to units, not secured in remote reserves. It meant treating basic health security the way the services treat fuel and munitions, as mission-critical resources tracked in readiness metrics rather than emergency add-ons. Second came the requirement for standing task force structures that could activate immediately. The 2020 crisis showed what happened when authority flowed through scattered agencies with little connective tissue. Decision speed collapsed. By building permanent joint medical task forces into plans like CONPLAN 8888, officers rehearsed integration with health authorities, FEMA, and state partners as if those ties already existed. This wasn't a general line-by-line rewrite, but targeted adoption of mechanisms to speed decisions when orders came cascading downward. Third, was the institutionalization of protective bubbles before deployments. NAVADMIN guidance laid this out clearly. Service members had to complete quarantine or restriction of movement sequestration in controlled settings, whether a ship's berthing, a barracks wing, or even private residences evaluated as compliant. What started as an ad hoc emergency measure hardened into doctrine. In practice, this meant units could train against future outbreaks with familiar concepts already embedded in the operating language of commanders. The zombie framework became the quiet vessel for those lessons. Where the text once described logistics convoys defending against contagion-bearing hordes, planners now understood those lines as shorthand for controlled corridors keeping pathogens from spreading between units. Outlines of evacuation zones doubled as drafts for field hospital placement. The absurd imagery kept the tone politically neutral, while the underlying procedures aligned with the very guidance that force health protection supplements and military instructions were issuing throughout the crisis. Condensing the memory of those chaotic months into doctrine served two purposes. It avoided future improvisation by ensuring personnel practiced around the very failures they had lived through. And it allowed educators to fold the scars of the pandemic into CONPLAN 8888 without announcing a dramatic overhaul to the public. Instead of a banner declaring pandemic plan, the zombie mask absorbed the revisions until classrooms were rehearsing timelines and coordination models sharpened by the COVID test itself. By 2025, the paradox had deepened. The document derided as a comic exercise carried within it structural fixes derived from pandemic failures. It mapped stockpiles, clarified chains of authority between federal and state officials, and normalized quarantine methods once considered extraordinary. For cadets and staff officers, these were no longer far-fetched hypotheticals. They were familiar, repeatable steps. The language stayed tongue-in-cheek, but the content contained some of the clearest outlines of how the military now expects to respond to mass health emergencies. That shift makes its way into how contingency education operates today. Students not only rehearse phases of control but practice embedding medical assets into deployment schedules, protecting supply lines with medical as well as combat logistics, and managing civilian panic when hospital access thins. Every weakness exposed in 2020, ventilator competition, contradictory command authority, scarcity of protective supplies, has been turned into problems to solve in the zombie classroom. For those inside these walls, the humor has worn thin. What matters is that those problems are no longer left to improvisation. The scars of COVID are now institutional memory, written not in after-action reports alone, but in the very structures through which planners are trained. The irony is that the only plan frank enough to record those scars still does so in the language of monsters. Beneath the surface, though, the revisions deal with real bottlenecks, real timelines, and real authority divisions. And that directs us to the next and most consequential adjustment: how authority and control are actually divided when every normal channel begins to fail. Because what the military discovered after COVID was not just a need for better logistics. It was that the question of who holds command when society tilts matters as much as how supplies move. The updated playbook, new phases and command protocols. The revised version of CONPLAN 8888 addresses the very issue that the original outline left unresolved. What happens when conventional structures begin to falter and direction is fractured? Early drafts divided collapse into 5 clean phases: shape the environment, deter the outbreak, seize the initiative, dominate the threat, and restore civil authority. It was a neat checklist for students practicing the joint operation planning and execution system. But the framework stopped short of saying who actually moved resources, issued commands, or aligned federal and military responses. The gaps worked for a safe training exercise in 2011. In the world after 2020, they were too severe to ignore. The updated playbook takes the 5 familiar phases and ties them to responsibilities, command chains, and coordination points, demonstrating how collapse is managed in real time rather than left as an abstract sequence on paper. A first change is the emphasis on hierarchy. The updated instruction reflects a deliberate move to make domestic command lines clear. Post-COVID guidance from the Department of Defense consistently aligns Homeland Support missions under Northern Command, or NORTHCOM, while broader strategic oversight remains tied to higher theater-level authorities. That adjustment is now built into the training version of the Zombie Plan, with NORTHCOM presented as the hub for evacuation support, medical logistics, and coordination with federal partners. Strategic Command, the author of the original 2011 draft, appears not as the day-to-day executor, but as a coordinating body. Its traditional role of syncing commands and ensuring strategic continuity is made explicit rather than assumed. The combination of those layers defines one of the most important messages of the revision. Separate the tactical burden of supporting civilians from the larger orchestration of interagency and intercommand functions. Officers learn the split as foundational, a correction to one of the original plan's thinnest points. Supply networks receive equal attention. Where the 2011 version used vague language about distributing aid, the updated playbook anchors logistics in visible structures. Planners see corridors described as national lifelines, designated routes meant to channel food and medical support without collapsing under congestion. Convoy prioritization is introduced as standard procedure, reflecting the painful lesson of 2020 when life-saving stockpiles sat immobile while demand spiked everywhere at once. Instead of improvising during a breakdown, officers are given a sequence for how aid should flow. Medical shipments and protective equipment clear first, followed by critical utilities and then bulk resupply. COVID taught the penalty for delay, and the zombie scenario absorbs that penalty into a rehearsal exercise. The corridors look like part of a fantasy map on paper, but the concepts mirror pandemic logistics reforms adopted across the DoD and FEMA after-action reviews. Another gap filled in the update is cyber defense. The first public draft of CONPLAN 8888 framed collapse almost entirely in physical terms. Infection in cities, mobs overwhelming installations, or resource scarcity accelerating panic. The latest framing demonstrates how those same conditions can be triggered or magnified by digital degradation. If malware disables emergency communications, or if false narratives flood civilian networks while quarantine operations begin, the collapse accelerates. The revised plan scripts cyber defense as an early move within the shaping phase. Standing liaison roles for Cyber Command are tied into both operational and strategic channels, underscoring that communications and information assurance demand equal protection alongside convoys and quarantine lines. The message inside the classroom is plain. In a crisis coded as zombie, the systems worth guarding are not only power stations and clinics, but also servers, networks, and traffic coordination hubs. Evacuation protocols received new specificity as well, another response to the confusion exposed in 2020. The scenario now integrates pre-written interoperability agreements. Rather than waiting on federal confirmation once normal channels fail, State Guard brigades use identical reference documents to activate regional muster stations, evacuation corridors, and quarantine zones. These locations are imagined as rural choke points away from population centers, scripted years in advance, so they can be activated even under communications blackout. Physical maps are built into the annexes, so a guard officer operating in isolation can still move people into controlled sites. That advanced clarity carries one clear lesson. Reaction time in a collapse is measured in days, not weeks. Training for initiations without waiting weeks for approval removes indecision at the moment it matters most. The presence of FEMA and CDC documents inside the annexes is particularly noteworthy. It departs from the usual separation between military and civilian playbooks. For the updated version to cross-reference both agencies, with similar phrasing and compatible steps, reflects an effort to ensure interoperability. In effect, this means military officers absorbing the zombie text are simultaneously rehearsing the language of civilian disaster plans. If pandemic conditions or public health collapse mirror the fictional outbreak, the integration avoids the disjointed signals seen during COVID. It anchors the concept that medical directives, law enforcement authority, and security support can mesh into a single coordinated front. The restructured phases themselves illustrate how much has shifted. To shape the environment now includes establishing continuity for digital networks. Deter means maintaining flow through logistics corridors so shortages do not trigger wider unrest. Seize initiative is defined by aggressive evacuation schedules and containment measures. Dominate involves scaling isolation and securing critical infrastructure, both physical and cyber. And restore ties back to rebalancing command between military and civil structures once stability is regained. The absurd exterior is retained, infected masses overrunning streets, but the bones of doctrine underneath look strikingly like real operational sequencing. The zombie skin hides a system that functions as a continuity rehearsal for collapse. What makes the 2025 update stand out from the initial outline is its determination to lock down practical authority. Where once the plan avoided saying who controlled which levers in fear of overstepping into real-world politics, the updated framework chooses to name processes plainly. Which headquarters coordinates federal medical supply distribution? Which command holds cyber contingencies? Which guard brigades can operate without federal clearance when lines are cut? These are spelled out in training language rather than concealed in abstraction. The open mask makes these discussions safer to have publicly, but the detail is pointed directly at avoiding another fractured national response. Even with the new structure, the plan is clear about one thing: these exercises are still fictional on their surface. Students reading through the text still see zombies labeled as categories, outbreaks measured in mock infections, and corridors marked against impossible scenarios. Yet within the training halls, every officer present reads the translation. Evacuations are real. Communications security is real. The prioritization of convoys is real. The zombie text remains a shield, but the job it covers is no longer light-hearted drill. It is the spine for a crisis rehearsal most other plans would be too sensitive to put in writing. The significance of this lies not only in procedures, but in the philosophy behind them. By structuring phases and command pathways in this way, the updated plan moves collapse rehearsal closer to operational doctrine. It acknowledges the possibility that events coded as fantasy scenarios may parallel real threats. That realization points naturally to the next layer of ambiguity. What, exactly, is the enemy imagined here? The answer has shifted over time, and with new tools and biotechnology emerging, the definition of a zombie pathogen itself no longer looks the same as it did when the plan was first written. From rabies to CRISPR, redefining the biological enemy. What began as a simple allegory has steadily morphed into something much more complex: the definition of the biological enemy itself. In the early drafts of CONPLAN 8888, the most obvious inspiration was rabies. Long before gene editing became part of the conversation, rabies stood out because of how it rewires its host: confusion, aggression, and violent behavior followed by death. It provided a plausible anchor for instructors who needed a recognizable disease to build their fictional outbreak upon, and it grounded the zombie idea in biological reality rather than pure fantasy. But by 2025, rabies serves only as an echo of the past. The focal point has shifted toward organisms with origins not in wildlife but in laboratories, a reflection of how military planners think about risk in an age of biotechnology. This shift parallels real-world advances in genetic engineering. Over the past decade, CRISPR turned what had once been laboratory speculation into practical technology. Its precision meant that organisms could be altered with far more control than older methods allowed. That capability carried obvious medical promise, but also raised security flags. If benign microbes can be edited, then the same tools could, in theory, produce pathogens designed for resilience, stealth, or psychological disruption. While CONPLAN 8888 never names CRISPR outright, its broadening of the pathogenic bucket after 2011 reveals an awareness that the line between natural and engineered threats has blurred. Instructors no longer treat zombies simply as mutated rabies victims, but as placeholders for lab-derived organisms whose effects could strain civil order in ways a wild virus never could. Historical experience reinforced those concerns. Gain-of-function experiments, created to anticipate future mutations by engineering them in advance, have been defended by some scientists as necessary preparation. Critics counter that the margin for error is razor-thin, pointing to real incidents like the 1979 Sverdlovsk anthrax leak in the Soviet Union or documented near misses in American labs. These incidents remind planners that accidental releases are not hypothetical. A leak from a high-containment facility, whether spore-forming bacteria, a misfolded protein, or an engineered viral strain, could spread under conditions closely resembling a zombie horde. Instructing officers to think through the logistics of responding to that scenario does not sensationalize the danger, but rather prepares them for what history proves can occur. Prion add another layer of unease. Unlike viruses or bacteria, prion are proteins that fold incorrectly and trigger degenerative brain diseases. In humans, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a known example, and in animals, chronic wasting disease has raised concerns about cross-species transmission. Engineers speculating about manipulated prion highlight the possibility of deliberately triggered neurological collapse. Symptoms like aggression, cognitive failure, and disorientation look disturbingly close to the behavior imagined in zombie case studies. By broadening the taxonomy of threats to include prion, planners acknowledge that destabilization could come not from a classic virus at all, but from something harder to detect, treat, or contain. This is where facilities like the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasures Center, NBAC, become critical to U.S. planning. Located at Fort Detrick, NBAC houses biosafety level 2, 3, and 4 labs capable of handling some of the world's most dangerous agents, the kind for which no vaccine or treatment yet exists. Its mission is explicitly defensive: analyze emerging threats, conduct bioforensics on suspicious samples, and model the effects of pathogens to guide preparedness. At the same time, the simple fact that such work must be done underlines the dual-use dilemma. To study how a tailored pathogen might spread, researchers must work with risks that, if mishandled, mirror the very catastrophes CONPLAN 8888 encodes behind the zombie metaphor. For planners, NBAC represents both reassurance that expertise exists and a reminder that absolute containment is never guaranteed. Alongside research facilities, global intelligence assessments have repeatedly reinforced why the military includes bioterror considerations in its training documents. A 2007 national intelligence estimate concluded that groups like Al-Qaeda would use biological weapons if capable. Since then, the threat profile has expanded to lone actors or state proxies equipped with portable aerosol dispersal tools. Ventilation systems in public or commercial buildings remain high-profile vulnerabilities. A pathogen seeded into an air intake requires no complex missile system, only a rudimentary sprayer. The damage would be silent, efficient, and immediate. When CONPLAN writers describe zombie spread through sharing air, the practical meaning is plain: aerosolized release through ducts or public spaces, a threat that still occupies counterterrorism briefings today. What makes the more recent revisions striking is not just the broader list of agents, but also the recategorization of older playful labels. Terms once written as tongue-in-cheek placeholders, prionic zombies or evil magic zombies, now function as coded categories for neurological agents, unconventional toxins, or unexpected vectors. The word choice is absurd on the surface, but the subtext is one of classification. Officers are trained to map unfamiliar pathogens against a taxonomy of scenarios without exposing those details to public panic. This allows military classrooms to address sensitive topics like engineered proteins or novel delivery mechanisms in a camouflage layer of humor. Yet with novelty comes persistent caution. International treaties like the Biological Weapons Convention exist precisely to place boundaries on research and deployment of biological agents. Oversight, regulation, and biosafety audits are not side notes. They surface repeatedly in Defense Science Board findings and other DoD documents. To acknowledge engineered threats in a plan like CONPLAN 8888 is not to declare they are imminent, but to make sure officers practice responses within ethical and legal frameworks that protect against misuse. Maintaining that balance between preparation and escalation is the tension underlying every biosecurity conversation in modern defense circles. What emerges from this? Reframing is a subtler picture than the popular imagination of zombie armies. In truth, the military's concern is less about cinematic hordes and more about pathogens resistant to medicine, organisms designed to disrupt cognition, or engineered releases that attack infrastructure through the air. Zombies act as shorthand for problems no single category of doctrine can contain. For trainees, the exercise means learning how to ask the right questions. Does an outbreak spread invisibly before symptoms? Will it resist antivirals? Which chains of authority activate when public order breaks? Those are the real scenarios hidden under the disguise. By replacing rabies with lab-derived adversaries, CONPLAN 8888 reflects an acknowledgement of how biological threats have evolved. Rabies once highlighted the devastation of natural infection. Today, the pressing concern is innovation, organisms designed intentionally or released accidentally from the very labs studying them. As the technology to build, edit, or release grows more accessible, the military treats these risks as part of its collapse scenarios. The language of zombies keeps the conversation light to outside readers, but the internal translation points straight at engineered hazards. The end result is that what started as allegory in 2011 has matured into a constant rehearsal for the consequences of biotechnology. Officers who once planned around wild animal vectors now practice responses to hypothetical, but plausible, lab accidents or engineered pathogens. Publicly, the zombies remain. Privately, the exercise functions as doctrine for bioterror prevention and continuity under genetic uncertainty. This evolution matters because any outbreak serious enough to destabilize domestic life does not stay confined to lab discussions. It lands in the streets, the hospitals, and most of all, the military installations tasked with holding the line when everything else begins to fracture. That is where the next set of questions lies, not in defining pathogens on paper, but in determining how secure the institutions themselves truly are once the gates must be closed. Securing the gates, base defense in an age of biological threats. Floodlights glare across a quarantine perimeter. Armed patrols adjust their routes, drones trace measured arcs above, and loudspeakers cycle instructions to personnel behind the wire. The image is familiar in training simulations, but its meaning has shifted. In 2011, the earliest draft of CONPLAN 8888 treated military installations like static fortresses, closed the gates, cut access, and the facility would endure until order returned. By 2025, that logic no longer holds. Perimeter walls and locked gates may slow entry, but they do little against 21st century threats like drone incursions, cyber sabotage, or pathogens carried past checkpoints by insiders. Updated doctrine now stresses that bases must operate less like sealed castles and more like layered continuity hubs, defending not just their fences but also utilities, digital networks, and the vital systems that keep operational cores functioning. Planning documents increasingly describe bases as nodes of strategic continuity. Each one supports fuel distribution, communications, medical stores, or housing for deployments. If those nodes falter under pressure, the ability to project national power falters with them. The COVID-19 years reinforced this lesson clearly. Bases discovered how quickly infections, supply chain breakdowns, or even rumors could fracture their function. The 2025 revisions take those vulnerabilities seriously, folding them into the mask of zombie outbreaks, but clearly referencing asymmetric attack vectors. Drones carrying payloads, cyber breaches disabling gates, or panicked masses surging toward fences all surface in scenarios coded in fictional language. The metaphor holds, but underneath it sits a sober rehearsal for disruptions that have already proven real. Access control sits at the center of this defense. New guidance emphasizes layered systems, not reliance on visual inspection or metal badges alone. Multi-factor authentication, fingerprints, retinal scans, or other biometric standards appears across NATO's Defense Against Terrorism Program of Work, DATPOW, projects and U.S. doctrine. These measures can be paired with temperature screening or biosensors, creating what the exercise describes as infection checks at the gate. In reality, the goal is to catch imposters, infiltrators, or symptomatic civilians before they add pressure to the installation. Scenarios call this zombie containment, but officers interpret it as an evolving requirement for identity integrity and health screening, especially during chaotic evacuations. Aerial defense shows the same doctrinal expansion. Radar arrays once calibrated for high-performance aircraft now must track small quadcopters carrying improvised payloads. Counter-US systems, researched and refined within DAT-POW and demonstrated in US trials, are increasingly referenced in CONPLAN training modules. Signal jamming, directed energy intercepts, and rapid launch counter-drones are no longer speculative tech expo concepts, but recognized baseline requirements for contested perimeters. Within the zombie framework, this is presented as airborne contagion vectors, a way to prepare officers for a future where drones smuggle surveillance devices or disperse hazardous material over a base otherwise locked down. The fiction conceals a present reality. Drone vulnerabilities already figure prominently in base security assessments. Utilities form the next weak point. During the pandemic, disruptions to power, water, or supply transportation quickly reduced base capacity without a single hostile act. That experience led planners to emphasize redundancy, not universally installed everywhere, but expected where feasible. Updated CONPLAN language treats utilities as mission-critical supply chains equivalent to food stocks or fuel. Guidance encourages installations to develop microgrids, secure power backups, water purification systems, or hardened communications redundancies, each scaled to base size. The script retains its outlandish cover, bases surviving after fictional contagion collapses city grids, but the instruction behind it is practical. Continuity requires off-grid capacity when national infrastructure fails. The link to NATO's wider counter-terror initiatives is deliberate. The Defense Against Terrorism program of work has focused on technology to mitigate non-conventional threats, including UAS, improvised explosives, and CBRN substances. Exercises funded under this program have tested electro-optical detectors, sensor nets, and even augmented reality tools for situational awareness. CONPLAN 8888's updated playbook cross-references this body of research. Inside the text, patrols repel infected mobs, while in practice the exercise is modeling interoperability with detection systems, chemical sensors, and CBRN monitoring tools relevant to real-world based security. That overlap ensures the camouflage language continues to mask serious integration of capability development. Civilian pressure adds another dimension. Historically, contingency plans gave little attention to what happens once desperate outsiders gather at gates. The newer framework recognizes that crowds are inevitable. Civilians see bases as refuges and will move toward them in search of security or aid. Without structured intake, that surge itself could destabilize an installation. Training scenarios reframe the crowd as zombies, pressing against checkpoints. In operational terms, the playbook now describes multiple layers: off-site muster stations, screening at pre-identified corridors, and segregation between cleared civilians and military personnel. Bases are not meant to serve as endless camps, but protocols acknowledge a balance: manage incoming civilians in controlled areas or risk uncontrolled breaches. Medical containment underpins this balance. Installations must preserve their own operational health bubbles, the same concept institutionalized in Navidman 217/20 at the height of COVID-19. Restriction of movement sequester policies, sometimes lasting weeks, created closed environments around deploying units to block infection vectors. That same policy now connects directly to the gates concept in CONPLAN script. Before civilians are admitted during crisis simulations, they are filtered through biosecurity corridors meant to prevent collapse from within. Training codes this as checking survivors for bite marks, but commanders know the real objective is to enforce RUM protocols at entry points when contagion risk is highest. Treat bases as protective bubbles, and ensure screening keeps those bubbles intact. The image of logistic hubs overwhelmed by sick civilians is not only theoretical. During 2020, bases found themselves balancing humanitarian aid deliveries with force protection requirements. The updated zombie scenarios encode those conflicts directly. Scenes of infected civilians demanding entry are metaphors for triage decisions confronting officers: who is admitted, who is quarantined, and how resources are allocated when medical care and supplies cannot keep pace. Emphasizing filtration nodes, secondary muster sites, and staged intakes is an attempt to instill decision-making habits before the crisis arrives. All of these defensive layers, access control, anti-drone measures, utility redundancy, and controlled civilian intake, reinforce the same instruction. Installations must remain operational even when surrounding institutions falter. They serve as continuity anchors, housing command systems, secure communications, and essential stockpiles until external order can be restored. Locking gates is no longer preparation enough. Security in 2025 means defending networks, protecting supply chains, countering aerial intrusion, and absorbing a degree of civilian pressure without collapsing from inside. Within the language of zombies, these steps read like theatrical drills. Guards test thermal scanners at a gatehouse to identify infection. Drone intercept systems practice neutralizing airborne carriers. Microgrids or fuel reserves are described as supply caches to outlast hordes. But behind the camouflage is a serious program of modernization, one that builds on NATO's DAT-POW initiatives and US DoD guidance. Bases remain the last protective rings around military continuity, and the updates acknowledge they will be tested simultaneously across multiple dimensions, not just physical attacks but biological, digital, and civilian-driven pressures. The effect is a blueprint for survival hubs rather than passive fortresses. The gates no longer mark the line between safety and chaos. They are screening thresholds, filtration systems, and negotiation points between order and desperation. And while the mask of fiction makes this acceptable training material, the actual dilemmas are drawn directly from experience over the last 2 decades. Which entry procedures hold when thousands arrive? How are drones countered while fuel systems are failing? When quarantines expand beyond capacity, what authority governs the response? These are the rehearsals concealed under the zombie narrative. The framework, however, points to a further gap, one not solved by biometric scanners or drone defenses. Because even if a base holds fast, even if the perimeter remains intact, the larger challenge remains waiting outside the wire. Collapse scenarios do not end at the gates, and no installation stays secure in isolation forever. That recognition leads directly to the next question planners had to confront: how nations move, shelter, and stabilize the millions left beyond the checkpoints. Civilian evacuation, the missing link. The weak point in the earliest version of CONPLAN 8888 was not its use of zombies or its stylized descriptions of ruin. It was the way civilians were addressed. The 2011 public draft devoted most of its focus to sustaining installations, securing airports, and designating military hubs. Civilian evacuation appeared only in passing, mentioned but not structured into the kind of sequences that govern military continuity. For a plan presented as national survival training, that imbalance left large parts of the population outside the framework, and it showed where institutional priorities lay. Preserve command and force endurance first, resolve the fate of civilians later. That gap quickly drew notice. Analysts pointed out that while the plan meticulously tracked the order of operations for maintaining formations, logistics, and command integrity, it offered almost no workable means of moving large urban populations caught in collapse. The omission looked less like an accident than a reflection of discomfort. Mass evacuations are politically charged. They require hard judgments about prioritization, involve civilian unrest, and can expose weaknesses in government capacity. By leaving evacuation only lightly addressed, the plan avoided those debates. Yet real crises, from Hurricane Katrina to the first months of COVID-19, made exactly those weak links visible: gridlock, fragmented coordination, delayed assistance that left vulnerable groups exposed. In the years after the pandemic, that silence eroded. Updated disaster planning within the DoD, FEMA, and CDC pushed civilian evacuation closer to the center. Once COVID exposed how delays in resource movement could become deadly, planners recognized that resilience depended not just on bases holding out, but also on civilians having a structured path out of danger. Within the zombie scenario, this translated into new layers of instruction meant to turn evacuation from peripheral mention into core procedure. The practical approach emerging by 2025 emphasizes several elements that earlier drafts lacked. One is prioritization. Post-COVID reviews consistently stressed that vulnerable groups, elderly populations, the sick, children, require movement early, alongside essential workers who keep health and food chains functional. Without such tiered priorities, evacuation becomes improvised in the moment, usually at the cost of those least able to self-evacuate. The updated zombie framework frames this as who clears the corridors first, a lightly coded way of training officers to accept that order of movement must be deliberate from the outset. Another is the physical mapping of controlled movement. Pre-identified evacuation corridors are now common across DoD and FEMA plans. Roads and rail lines can be temporarily designated and secured for orderly flows rather than left to spontaneous masses. Screenings, checkpoints, and triage nodes along the way can prevent corridors from magnifying panic. In zombie language, this appears as quarantine corridors guarded against infection. In reality, it means drawing maps in advance so the channels for movement exist before panic sets in. Crowd control and enforcement pose the next layer. The 2011 plan was vague here, but post-COVID experience made vagueness untenable. Updated frameworks emphasize the National Guard as the primary instrument for keeping evacuation routes usable. This aligns with how their legal role is structured. Guard units operate under governors, support FEMA, and provide policing functions in domestic emergencies without conflicting as directly with the Posse Comitatus Act. If evacuees clog highways or resist quarantine, these missions are expected to fall first to guard forces, backed by state agencies, with federal coordination available through task forces. The distinction matters. Using guard formations grounds the enforcement role in familiar legal authority, whereas deploying federal active duty units inside cities triggers constraints that only apply under extraordinary measures like the Insurrection Act. By embedding this nuance inside the zombie story, planners train officers on chain of authority during civilian unrest without inflaming public sensitivity. Still, every blueprint wrestles with the fragility of infrastructure. The updated framing assumes highways remain passable, fuel allocations can keep convoys moving, and basic communications still function. History warns otherwise. After natural disasters or during surges like 2020, highways jammed in hours, cell towers failed under stress, fuel depots ran dry. With those realities in mind, contingency planning developed additional stopgaps, secondary muster locations outside urban cores, and distributed supply caches seated in less volatile terrain. These alternate muster zones are deliberately rural, fairgrounds, county airstrips, or agricultural fields that can be rapidly converted into controlled spaces. The goal is not permanent shelter but manageable waypoints. Civilians unable to flow through main corridors could head to these areas where guard units establish temporary water, food, and heat. Instead of processing millions collapsing into a single city, authorities divide those flows into smaller groups, easing stress on formal evacuation routes and minimizing confrontation at base gates. Supply distribution received similar redundancy. During pandemic surges, convoys entering city centers faced blockades of traffic, unrest, or opportunistic violence. Relief often froze before reaching those who needed it. The updated approach suggests using distributed supply nodes set away from central urban axes. These warehouses and caches function as safety valves. Civilians can access essentials without massing toward a single hub. Within the allegory, these appear as hidden survivor caches. In practical terms, they are low-profile provisioning points designed to prevent urban collapse from becoming uncontrollable flashpoints. Together, these elements, the priority lists, the map corridors, the guard-led enforcement, the rural muster zones, and the distributed supplies, fill what once looked like blank space in the original document. They are not written as literal step-by-step instructions in an unclassified zombie plan, but they mirror procedures reinforced after COVID by DoD memoranda, FEMA protocols, and CDC guidance. The methodology is consistent. Assume mass movement will happen, structure it early, spread pressure points wide, and preserve public confidence before panic erases coordination. The improvements are noticeable, yet they sit atop unresolved vulnerabilities. Every one of these measures assumes a baseline of functional infrastructure. Without fuel, secured convoys cannot move. Without communications, evacuees cannot receive orders or directions to muster zones. Without disciplined coordination, even designated corridors can collapse into the same gridlock seen in past disasters. The auxiliary measures, rural staging sites, and distributed supply depots try to account for this, but even they require civilians to know where to go and to trust the information reaching them. The foundation is stronger than in 2011, yet still precarious if the social systems layered underneath disintegrate. For officers using the zombie framework as their reference, the message is clear. Civilian evacuation was once an afterthought. Today it is foreground, mapped into the exercises as a core component of continuity planning. The fiction remains in place. Planners talk about screening survivors and escorting populations past contagion zones. But through that mask, the practical takeaway is obvious. Resilience depends on not leaving civilians stranded outside the gates. And yet, even the most careful evacuation script stops at the nation's borders. Quarantine corridors, guard checkpoints, supply caches, all presume the outbreak begins at home. They do not answer the equally pressing question of what happens when the first reports arrive not from U.S. soil, but from cities overseas. That question forces planners to widen the frame, shifting from national evacuation diagrams to the fragile international systems designed to trade warning before crises spread. International dimensions, zombies without borders. What happens when the signals of collapse emerge abroad first? That is the premise threaded through the newer training versions of CONPLAN 8888. The original 2011 text kept its focus on domestic ground, imagining a crisis erupting inside U.S. territory and spreading outward. But reality has made that model too narrow. The speed of international travel, the density of trade, and the reality of laboratories working with high-risk organisms mean the first warning is more likely to appear in a foreign port, airport, or hospital than on an American runway. The challenge then is not just one of defense, but of early detection, where the indicators surface, who notices them, and how they move into U.S. and allied channels in time to matter. This is where NATO gains a central role. The alliance has made asymmetric threats, including terrorism with biological or chemical undertones, a permanent part of its strategic concept. NATO emphasizes deterrence and defense, crisis prevention, and cooperative security as its core tasks, and biological events fit within all three. At its headquarters, intelligence coordination structures exist specifically to track irregular threats. There is a dedicated terrorism intelligence cell and a special coordinator for counterterrorism, designed to bring together reporting from across member states into a single situational picture. In the training mask of zombies, these become reference points for monitoring infected populations. In practice, what this signals to officers is that NATO already maintains machinery for aggregating threat data and deploying consequence management units when CBRN risks emerge abroad. The Defense Against Terrorism program of work illustrates how that machinery translates into capability. Founded in 2004, it coordinates projects funded across the alliance to protect against improvised explosive devices, unmanned aircraft systems, and chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear agents. The research is not theoretical. Demonstrators include CBRN sensors, detection grids, and even counter-US defenses. In the zombie exercise, this becomes the metaphor of multinational units screening ports or harbors against contagion. The practical lesson is that NATO's investments already integrate across borders, creating a pooled security structure that member forces, including the United States, rely on for forward warning and consequence management. The combined Joint CBRN Defense Task Force is an even clearer signal to students working through the updated scenario. This NATO capability exists to deploy into affected areas, assess risks, and manage the aftermath of CBRN incidents. Its role is not fantasy. In the framework of CONPLAN, it is described in theatrical code as a coalition responding to an outbreak zone. But the aim is to show officers where real reinforcement can come from. The United States does not depend on NATO for domestic command. It depends on NATO and allied structures for signals abroad and for joint operations when instability touches foreign ground. The scenario encodes this point. NATO contributes early detection and deployable response capacity, not America's domestic chain of command. Health agencies also appear, but with careful positioning. The World Health Organization is acknowledged as an international body with reach, but its role in the framework is marked as slower and more consensus-driven than the intelligence paths NATO cultivates. The lesson is pragmatic. Who facilitates multinational agreement on public health restrictions, while military planners expect the fastest data from allied defense and intelligence exchanges. The coded zombie sections describe who is distributing warnings to neighboring villages after the horde is already in motion. Stripped of metaphor, the point is made plain. Military response models rely on rapid intelligence reporting, not solely on delayed international declarations. One of the most practical implications of this global orientation is the handling of unclassified data. Lessons from COVID showed how delays in sharing information, sometimes trapped inside classified corridors, cost days or weeks, during which infections spread unmonitored. The updated framework emphasizes that data with unclassified status, especially epidemiological reporting, should flow faster and wider, bypassing the bottlenecks of classification. Within the zombie story, this appears as open calls for sightings of hordes, shared across simple systems. Officers are told to recognize the translation. Rapid case reporting, hospital overload statistics, and field observations matter more for buying lead time than tightly held intelligence packages. The practical lesson is prioritizing speed over secrecy, even if that means sharing through networks accessible to many. The strain in these scenarios lies with trust. Instructors build drills where governments overrun by infection, delay disclosure to shield tourism or stability. The simulation teaches that hesitation is predictable and concealment by rivals is guaranteed. Officers must assume reporting is already late and make decisions knowing an outbreak has advanced beyond the sanitized accounts broadcast abroad. Exercises often use fictional proxies, scenes of cities silencing reports before contagion spills outward. The translation for real planning is clear. Expect denial and suppression, and prepare to act before official statements catch up. That expectation underscores why surveillance is framed as a security function, not a purely medical one. Officers are drilled to integrate reports from foreign hospitals and ports with aerospace surveillance and communications intercepts, cross-checking signals against intelligence before politicians or public health ministries confirm the situation. In the coded plan, this is the equivalent of monitoring zombie movements through satellite imagery, intercepted signals, or anomalies in census tracking. The mask permits a delicate subject to be taught openly, Intelligence can, and often does, spot outbreak conditions before declarations make them official. From there, the focus shifts to how circulation works between allies. The shift away from purely classified exchanges to rapid epidemiological signals is modeled as critical. Officers rehearse what routes remain open if classified networks stall. Military-to-military dialogue, allied reporting channels, and even public feeds drawn from international labs. NATO's Science for Peace and Security program is cited as an example of networks already uniting allied and partner scientists across borders to anticipate these problems. Through research workshops, training, and data sharing, this program illustrates the reality that when speed is paramount, science networks need to mesh with security alliances. The scenario encodes this as villagers trading sightings, but again the subtext is about near real-time sharing of medical indicators. All of this creates the recurring theme that outbreaks abroad become domestic realities within days. Flights land before diagnostic tools catch up. Civilians disperse before checkpoints lock down. What NATO and allied reporting achieve at best is a short lead time, hours or days to trigger containment before a surge crosses borders visibly. The military mask keeps the imagery fictional, but the officers absorbing the lessons map those timelines onto their own tasks. Base lockdowns, activation of guard formations, surge planning, and coordination with FEMA and DHS. Even in this international frame, the fictional language performs its shielded role. Nations prone to delay or disinformation are never named. Instead, scenarios refer to cities swarming with infection or governments masking outbreaks. Students understand the underlying point without attaching blame in an unclassified document. The exercise makes space to discuss a reality. Secrecy and politics are constants, and continuity must plan around them. The conclusion drawn from these international lessons is procedural rather than symbolic. Intelligence pipelines must favor speed. Alliance structures must be built into the warning cycle, and open-source epidemiology plays as important a role as classified intercepts. That is the updated picture painted in the zombie-coded lens. Outbreaks do not respect borders. The line between over there and back home is measured in flight schedules, not maps. And the entire exercise drives home that the first signal abroad triggers the countdown clock for domestic defense. What remains outside these unclassified outlines, however, is just as significant. The zombie framework shows cadets how alliances might detect contagion, how NATO structures and unclassified data could buy hours or days. But what sits behind the blacked-out pages, the annexes withheld when the plan was released to the public, supposedly describes other tools, other contingencies, and scenarios too sensitive to filter into classrooms under friendly disguise. That absence leads naturally to the next question. What is hidden inside the sections no one outside the vaults is allowed to see? The hidden annexes, classified shadows of 8,888. When the declassified pages of CONPLAN 8888 surfaced through FOIA requests, readers saw a strange hybrid of military jargon and tongue-in-cheek humor. Yet in between the jokes about undead threats, the footnotes and cross-references pointed repeatedly to sections no one outside the clearance system could actually read. Entire annexes were listed, but instead of operational detail, the file displayed blacked-out blocks marked secret or higher. These redactions were not marginal notes. They appeared at phase breaks, deployment descriptions, and command diagrams. What the public received was a shell, the visible structure of a military plan without the operational core beneath it. That repeated pattern makes the annexes themselves a crucial part of the intrigue. Their existence is not speculative, they are directly named, then withheld. Reviewing the unclassified draft is a reminder that the real strategies were deliberately carved away. What emerges publicly is an outline, useful for practice in classrooms, stripped of the instructions that actually govern action. For any reader, it raises the obvious question. If the theatrical script is all that is shown, what functional playbook lies behind the curtain? The public text leaves breadcrumbs, though they are carefully phrased. Categories of fictional adversaries appear: mutants, extraterrestrial infections, even the idea of space zombies. Standing alone, the phrasing reads like parody. But when these descriptors sit alongside secret labels, the tone shifts. It is unlikely that annexes describe monsters literally. More likely, according to defense research practices, those categories map loosely onto sensitive threat models. Spaceborne contamination studied by the space community, prion disorders with neurological consequences, or biological emergencies where force posture escalates rapidly. None of these are confirmed in the annexes themselves, but the location of the redactions suggests they connect to how forces would actually deploy, how rules of engagement would change, and where interagency chains of command intersect under biological stress. This framing matches the way military planning operates in general. Unclassified CONPLANs provide students and junior officers with a skeletal model, phases of response, strawman adversaries, and broad concepts of support. Classified annexes, meanwhile, house the actionable. Detail, unit orders, resource prioritization, force thresholds, and contingency authorization. The zombie plan fits this pattern neatly. Rather than dismissing the redactions as flavor, it is more consistent to assume that they follow established habits of operational writing. Where the text references nuclear escalation or coordinated biodefense, FOIA reviewers consistently remove the supporting annex. That is standard logic, logistical blueprints, tactical thresholds, and high-end countermeasure inventories are precisely the kinds of information adversaries would exploit if they became available. The suspicion builds partly because of where the blackouts fall. After sections describing recovery phases, redactions appear instead of continuation. Following logistics support, annexes vanish. These gaps align with the kind of material one expects in tactical annexes: deployment checklists, interagency duty assignments, and rules of escalation. The more colorful categories in the unclassified draft, zombies carried by satellites or magical infections, fit the pattern of placeholders, a way to practice against threats with no diplomatic weight. But the heart of the guidance, how to actually sustain operations if national infrastructure breaks, is what remains sealed. This logic becomes clearer when comparing 8888 with other contingency documents. Pandemic planning has its own CONPLAN designation, as do counter-WMD operations and space defense. Each is heavily classified. Seen this way, an unclassified zombie plan is not contradictory but complementary. It allows the Pentagon to admit a dramatic-sounding apocalypse plan exists, while redirecting attention away from the fact that classified partners hold the genuine response architecture. The annexes likely fold directly into those neighboring plans, tying fictional imagery into real frameworks for influenza, CBRN containment, or orbital asset security. FOIA reviewers would naturally cut these links, since cross-referencing to sensitive CONPLANs would compromise secrecy. For outside readers, the effect is blank spaces dotted across the text, suggesting far more serious material than the humorous mask on the surface. Even weaponry references follow the same pattern. In the accessible draft, decisive force becomes shorthand for scare tactics, an easy way to joke about overwhelming firepower. But annexes are where weapon platforms would actually be named, thresholds for escalation spelled out, and classified countermeasure reserves recorded. Military doctrine has a predictable rhythm, public frameworks at high levels, operational annexes under lock. The missing parts of 8888 fit that rhythm rather than floating as anomalies. That predictability, however, does little to quiet curiosity. The two-layer split is deliberate. To outsiders, the zombie plan is playful, entertaining, and odd enough to avoid scrutiny. To insiders, the unseen annexes are where operational thinking is secured. An ordinary observer laughs at the absurd details while trained officers recognize the blank pages as signposts to the real manual. Rules of engagement if pandemics spill over borders, resource distribution under collapse, or continuity procedures under space-related contamination. The distraction works precisely because one side finds humor, while the other side finds operational discipline. The choice to leave part of the framework visible, rather than lock it away, is itself functional. With an unclassified draft circulating, cadets and young officers gain a resource for practicing planning without breaching security rules. Journals can cite the zombie material openly, encouraging discussion of logistics and emergency authority. Media outlets translate the plan into late-night segments, keeping curiosity contained to jokes. All the while, annexes in parallel house the polished responses to bioterror, lab breaches, or catastrophic orbital events. It is a balance that lets attention slide from the reality, even as professionals practice against it. This pattern is not unique to the zombie plan. Many defense policy documents follow a dual structure: a visible high-level overview framed in generic or fictional terms, and hidden annexes containing the specifics. It is a well-established method for signaling transparency while guarding operational integrity. In 8888, the camouflage is simply brighter, tilted deliberately toward parody. But the mechanism is familiar. Readers who scroll through the FOIA copy without noticing the repeated annex cuts see only training material. Those who pause at the labels recognize that substantive instructions exist, only shifted beyond reach. The lasting irony is that the Pentagon's most widely mocked planning document may also contain some of its most detailed biological defense annexes. What the public sees as satire could be the entry point to serious countermeasure portfolios and continuity operations. News cycles rarely linger on this possibility, but officers who train with the document know to read the silence as carefully as the text. The black rectangles between paragraphs are not filler. They are markers indicating where the real planning takes place. Reasonable curiosity follows. If the open text is absurdity by design, but the references consistently direct readers to annexes, then the plan exists as a two-tiered document. Spectacle on one level, classified doctrine on the other. The public cannot confirm what fills those gaps, but experience with other plans suggests likely contents. Movement orders, interagency protocols, weapons thresholds, and inventory of specialized capabilities. These are the exact topics stripped to prevent adversaries from building mirror responses. The more surreal the public label, the more it conceals the routine logic underneath. The enduring question is therefore not whether annexes exist. They do, but why the dual structure was constructed in the first place. Is the zombie framework a cover for rehearsing collapse without panic? Is it a convenient mask that distracts rivals by making the material look absurd? Or is it both, a double-use plan optimizing training and concealment simultaneously? If the zombie surface is playful but the sealed annexes carry the muscle of biodefense procedure, then CONPLAN 8888 is not only a cultural oddity. It is a case study in how strategy hides its details in plain view. The contrast feeds curiosity, but curiosity never lifts classification. Which leaves the question for readers on the outside. If the public plan is satire while repeatedly pointing to redacted annexes, what operational capabilities are being kept behind clearance, and why? What matters next is seeing how that mask operates outside the Pentagon itself. Because while annexes speak to classified shadows, the zombie story at large reached far beyond operational circles, shaping how ordinary people absorb disaster logic in everyday life. The zombie mask, a training tool for everyone. By 2011, the Pentagon had its training scenario committed to paper, but outside those halls, millions of people were already rehearsing collapse through a very different channel. Zombie imagery had saturated screens and shelves. Television series, films, video games, and novels turned the undead into a consistent metaphor for disaster. Viewers followed characters improvising barricades, scavenging supplies, and forming fragile alliances under pressure. These were stories meant as entertainment, but their repetition normalized the idea of what life might feel like if everyday systems failed. Between 2010 and 2025, the culture became a rehearsal space, one that spread instinctive questions through households. What would I do? Where would I go? And who could I trust if tomorrow resembled one of those storylines? The Pentagon used zombies to teach planning logic to officers. Civil society did its own version by absorbing collapse narratives dressed as fiction. Zombie tales follow a recognizable pattern: sudden breakdown, absence of official information, and ordinary people forced to solve problems alone. Audiences watching those events often carried the scenarios into their own imaginations. At home, people asked themselves how they'd respond: who to call if phones went dark, how to find safe water, or which neighbor would be reliable under stress. Watching a character forage wasn't just a plot point. It seeded the audience with the idea that improvisation and rationing could be routine survival steps. Over time, those images formed mental blueprints that echoed preparedness logic without any formal instruction. What felt like escapism gave people a frame for thinking about shortages, distrust, and fragile order. Public agencies recognized the opening. At the height of zombie popularity, the Centers for Disease Control launched a preparedness campaign explicitly framed around the same metaphor. The language spoke in the lingo of outbreaks, but the substance inside the material was entirely practical. Store water, keep food, set a family plan, and know where to shelter. By playing within cultural fascination, the CDC used humor to grab attention while delivering basic emergency guidelines. People remembered the joke, but they also remembered to check pantries or talk to family about contingencies. That blurring, a fictional wrapper containing real preparedness steps, meant popular culture and public health messaging moved in parallel. Across a decade and a half, the fiction itself reinforced core behaviors. Again and again, characters in zombie stories survived not by superhuman strength, but by rationing supplies, managing trust, and balancing cooperation with caution. Viewers saw protagonists succeed by stockpiling food, establishing safe zones, and filtering who they trusted under duress. These repeating patterns made certain ideas common sense: that survival required choices about resources, judgment about social circles, and systems for maintaining order. Officers practicing in classrooms under zombie scripts rehearsed similar dilemmas, while millions of civilians watching entertainment internalized those same frameworks without instructions ever being handed down. The effect surfaced during crises. When the first lockdowns of COVID-19 emptied supermarket shelves, many people reached for canned goods, batteries, and bottled water. Government recommendations played a part, but cultural memory added reinforcement. Decades of zombie fiction had already displayed scenes of scarcity and panic at the store. The behavior felt familiar because audiences had watched it countless times in scripted form. When the moment arrived in reality, preparation felt less foreign. Instructors later noted that what played out publicly mirrored choices officers had rehearsed in simulation. At military schools, zombies remained a useful teaching mask for cadets. Outside, the same imagery shaped civilian assumptions about collapse. Some analysts described this as coincidence. Pop culture rewarded interest, government agencies leveraged it when possible, but no deliberate coordination existed. What mattered was convergence. Civil audiences digested emergency logic through repeated stories, while planners saw cultural shorthand they could adopt for training without backlash. Both groups ended up translating the same metaphor into their own domain. This overlap created a softer form of preparation. Civilians did not walk away experts in logistics or command. They did not treat zombie films as literal instruction manuals. But by 2020 it was clear that repeated exposure to collapse tropes had made certain responses less alien. Stockpiling essentials, questioning rumors, and thinking about trust dynamics in neighborhoods required less explanation. Familiar images primed behaviors, not uniformly or perfectly, but enough to register when shelves emptied or when conflicting guidance shook confidence. Zombie storylines had normalized a broad idea. Survival under collapse meant rationing, cautious social circles, and improvisation. The stories carried risks of distortion as well. Dramas resolved within a season, victories often came quickly, and protagonists often survived through luck. Real disasters unfold slower, with harsher costs and fewer clean resolutions. The discrepancy between narrative and reality left room for overconfidence. Still, the building blocks on display in fiction, maintaining supplies, establishing lines of trust, improvising under pressure, mapped onto the very basics official plans stress. Entertainment oversimplified, but in doing so it still familiarized audiences with patterns that mattered. The influence spread beyond screens. Families began to use zombie survival as shorthand when discussing planning. Websites and blogs used the trope to package household preparedness, bug-out bags, off-grid cooking, and water filtration tutorials. It allowed sobering conversations to unfold with lowered resistance, disguised as playful hypotheticals. The codes of entertainment distributed practical lessons inadvertently. Staging scenarios around zombies made them approachable, while still embedding survival tactics inside the narrative. This broad cultural rehearsal was unplanned. The Pentagon never issued instructions for civilians to take cues from television. But the convergence was obvious. One side designed zombies as a safe training adversary. The other side consumed collapse scenarios as horror and drama. Together, both sets of rehearsal reinforced each other. By the time a real pandemic arrived, officers inside installations and civilians watching news feeds already shared a visual vocabulary. Empty streets looked familiar. Quarantines echoed storylines. The language of collapse had become common ground. The sense of recognition that surfaced in 2020 was not accidental coincidence, so much as cultural alignment. When supply chains wavered and official messaging struggled, public health agencies fell back on the same metaphor they once used playfully. Preparedness graphics with zombies recirculated, this time less ironic than before. The cultural script allowed officials to reach audiences quickly because the imagery was already lodged in memory. Fiction had made the abstract tangible. By 2025, analysts recognized that zombie culture had served as mass rehearsal by convergence rather than design. For civilians, entertainment provided a space to test ideas and imagination. For officers, training masked sensitive planning within a neutral adversary. Agencies like the CDC found the storyline useful to carry household preparedness instructions. The result was a shared shorthand. Zombies became the code linking public attention, public health messaging, and military education about collapse. That shared metaphor offered real benefits. It reduced the time officials needed to explain concepts like quarantine, rationing, or safe zones because citizens had already built associations through years of fiction. It made public briefings easier and turned once esoteric emergency ideas into household language. Officers and health workers alike could reference zombies without derailment, knowing their audiences already understood the shape of collapse the word described. The mask carried through, smoothing communication when speed mattered most. The persistence of the zombie mask suggests that fiction can function as preparation when official channels leverage it carefully. Audiences did not believe in the literal undead, but they accepted the lessons carried inside those storylines. From classrooms to living rooms, the impossible scenario let people rehearse the consequences of grid failure, scarcity, and disrupted trust. That convergence explains why commanders and civilian agencies still use the metaphor. It is an efficient code for conditions too grim when framed directly, which draws the script toward its final recognition. When zombies appear in entertainment or in military education, the mask is fantasy, but the rehearsals underneath are not. What citizens absorbed through spectacle and what officers practiced in training pointed toward the same reality. Systemic collapse is possible, and the outlines of response can be rehearsed before it happens. The next step is understanding what that means when the mask is lifted, and how much of the fiction has always been about real threats hiding beneath its language. CONPLAN 8888 began as a training tool built on an impossible enemy, but layered with post-COVID lessons and updated interagency doctrine, it now functions as a practical framework for thinking about how societies unravel and how they can be held together. It shows that preparation no longer happens only inside classified halls or fictional stories. Policy and daily habits both shape who withstands the first days of collapse. Preparation is happening now, and the next emergency will reward those who actually practiced. Which redacted annex would you most want declassified? Medical logistics, command chains, or CBRN countermeasures? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this useful, don't forget to like and subscribe.